Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah says yes, and that's only the beginning. Earlier today, Senator Hatch went on the record about that and Washington's wild spending spree. All right, Senator, you've been quoted in terms of the health care bill. You've been quoted as saying recently that it's an awful piece of crap and a dumbass program. Now, how do you really feel about it?
Well, I guess I should tell you how I really feel, because it's a lot worse than that. It really is a bad piece of legislation. Everybody knows it, including the president. I don't see why he keeps pushing it the way he is. They know it's not going to work, and I know what they're doing. If he gets reelected, I think within a couple of years he'll throw his hands in the air and say it's not working, it's not good, we've got to go to a single-payer system.
GAO report said recently that, for instance, with Medicare, Medicaid fraud, I think the number is something, $48 billion a year in fraud and waste.
We just had, before our committee, the two top investigators in this area, and they admitted that it's much more than that. In fact, some have admitted it's as high as over $200 billion a year in fraud and waste and
so
so
when do we
forth.
go after? Because if you look at, I mean, some have thought, I know you voted against a continuing resolution which struck $60 billion in this year's budget, but if we'd gone out and recovered the 48, forget the $200 billion number you mentioned, but if we'd gone out and gotten the 48 billion, we'd only need $12 billion in cuts to meet the $60 billion if we just go find what we're wasting.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that. If we found that, and you add that over 10 years, that's $500 billion. I mean, and you can go on and on. I was just looking the other day, and there are 20 different homelessness programs. I mean, you know, and you can extrapolate that throughout the whole bureaucracy. This place has gone out of control.
Nobody has really gone after it with in earnest.
Well, these two top investigators and bureaucratic people over the healthcare system really are trying to go after it over Medicare. And I have to say, they've got like 1,700 people working for them. And they're still finding fraud all over the place. We just have to do a better job, and we've got to not have duplicative programs like we have. And I have to admit, both sides are at fault here.
I wonder if the American people are getting a little bit gamed on the numbers. It seems that we talk in different numbers. If you want something to look giant, we hear the numbers in terms of a 10-year payout. If you want it to look small, you do it in a 1 year. I mean, it's gotten a little bit confusing.
Or take the health care program. You know, it really doesn't really trigger to 2014. Why was that the case? So they could claim it was a little less than $1 trillion. Look, that's why federalism really can work. Each state can look at all the other states and say, hey, I like that idea over there, let's incorporate it in our state. And it's become this liberal approach towards everything having to be done by the federal government. And it's the worst entity to do all of these things.
Is it a management issue essentially then? I mean, in terms of it's just unmanageable to have the federal government do it?
I think it's both. I think it's political. I think you have, look, do you want to know the truth? Some of these, you know, less than 7% of our private sector union members. And they're starting to wake up to the fact that these government sector unions, that they're costing them an arm and a leg in taxes and expenses and everything else. They're pricing themselves out of the marketplace, and it's because the unions control one party, and that party gets in power, and next thing you know, they're satisfying every union demand that they have. The private sector union members, of which I was a part at one time, learned my trade. I was a skilled tradesman. The private sector union members are getting dinged an arm and a leg for big, expensive public sector union costs.
One quick question on, you mentioned unions. Do you have a message for Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin?
Hang in there, Scott. We're all watching, because I'll tell you, I think it's really almost unmentionable that those Democrats won't come back and vote and face the music. And look, most states don't have collective bargaining. The federal government doesn't have collective bargaining. Most states, and the reason they don't is because they don't want the people who elect you to be able to demand more and more and more and more in pensions and other benefits and so forth that go beyond what the private sector can afford to pay for. And like I say, I bring that contrast between the private sector union members and the public sector union members who are sitting in fat cat jobs and fat cat benefits compared to the private sector who has to pay for it.
The debt. What are we going to do about it?
Well, we've got to get more fiscal conservatives here. There's no question about it. And I think the House now has fiscal conservatives, and we've got to get people to understand the truth, because they're going to get badgered and beaten up and so forth because they're trying to get things under control. We've got to have less government.
Can you just pick up the phone and call President Obama and say, look, we'd like to come and just sit down and talk to you off the record, without the cameras, without a lot of attention?
I can do that, yes. And I've been down there at the White House, and I made some of these points down there. They just ignore them. So
what's at the basis of it, though? Is it ineptitude, incompetence, greed, selfishness? They think they have a better way. There may be a better way. You could be wrong. I mean, what is it?
All of the above, but it's really power hungry. It's seeking after power and control.
And you think the president? You think the president is doing that?
Well, I don't know that he's personally doing that, but he should be leading. We know that to get spending under control, we've got to reform the entitlement programs.
Well, he says he wants to get spending. He says he's concerned about the debt.
But he's unwilling to lead. I guarantee you, he's unwilling to lead.
Is he lying when he says that?
I would never call him that. I like the president personally, but let me tell you something. It's going to take presidential leadership. There's nobody with any brains that doubts that statement. It will take presidential leadership up front, and we'll come behind him to get things done if he'll lead. But it's going to take presidential leadership to lead. Now, will his party allow him? The answer to that is probably not. He's not leading anyway. If I was president, I'd say, look, we're going to solve these problems, and I'm going to lead on them, and we're going to do it in the most reasonable way we can that is not damaging.
Don't you think he thinks he's doing that?
I believe he's sincere. I believe that he's a very interesting and I think a good man. I don't think that, if you really want my opinion, I think that he just doesn't know what to do. And some of us would help him to know if he'd work with us. But I got to tell you, I think that's part of it. I think he's inexperienced. We put a man in as president who had 2 years as a senator. The rest of his life was a community organizer. I mean, my gosh, that's important. But for president of the United States, he's a likable guy. He's articulate. He's charismatic. I think he's a good-looking person, handsome man. He's a person you want to like. You want him to be a success as the first African-American president. And it set a wonderful example. But he's not leading. That's the problem. And some of us would help him lead. He can have the credit.
Straight ahead, we are only